Good afternoon. This week, one of your objectives is to write an effective FLA conclusion that, number one, grabs the reader's attention. That's why I've given you this album cover, So What by Joe Walsh, because I hope it's attention grabbing, but also it's relevant because the piece of this particular assignment that I want to talk about is being able to rephrase your thesis and answer the question, so what? I think this is really crucial because unless you're able to answer that question, all you've got is a bunch of meaningless words. You must be able to understand and be able to articulate the answer to that question. So what? So I would like to tell you a story about how I learned to answer that question. And to tell you that story, I need to go all the way back to high school. In high school, the only time I ever skipped class was to attend a lecture by the author Natalie Babbitt. The lecture she gave was called Fantasy and the Classic Hero. In her lecture, she described how she felt as a fantasy author that she was trapped, that she was always taking her child protagonists away from their parents and doing other things, and she discovered only subconsciously that she was actually following the hero journey pattern that was originally found by Joseph Campbell. And she talked about Joseph Campbell's book, The Hero with a Thousand Faces. Well, immediately after the lecture, I ran to the BYU library and checked out a copy of The Hero with a Thousand Faces and began to read it. So Babbitt's lecture was a life-changing experience, and as I looked at the hero journey, I became fascinated. Now, I imagine that most of you are fairly familiar with Campbell's pattern, which he found in the mythology of cultures all over the world. This pattern begins at home. The hero departs, they are called to their adventure. Sometimes there is a herald that calls them. They pass a threshold and go into a place where they are tried and tested, where they are initiated, where they go through difficulties. Campbell refers to some of the difficulties as being in the belly of the whale. But then they return. They return home with a boon, something, a gift, knowledge that they have received in this time away from home that they're able to share with those back home. This particular model of the hero journey is something I made for my master's thesis. So years later, after encountering Natalie Babbitt in high school, I did write my master's thesis on the idea of the hero journey and how it applies to, books for children. But I ran into a problem. My thesis coordinator, professor, looked at my analysis and basically said, so what? So I had to go back to square one. What was the reason I was doing this analysis? It doesn't matter necessarily that everything can, or many things can fit into this hero journey pattern, so I did have to ask myself the question, so what? What is the purpose of this? And so I thought about it, and one day I was sitting in a class thinking about the hero journey pattern and answering that so what question, when all of a sudden it hit me like a bolt of lightning. Joseph Smith's first vision was a hero journey. Just like that pattern I've shown you, Joseph Smith leaves home. He has a herald that calls him on his adventure, which is the scripture from John 1:5. He goes to the woods, the zone of magnified powers, and then he is overcome by darkness. He goes into the belly of the whale. He is initiated. He overcomes the darkness, and at the very point he is ready to give himself over to complete despair, he sees a pillar of light immediately above his head. He receives a message and then immediately returns back home with this boon and tells his mother, I have learned for myself that Presbyterianism is not true. So the point I want to make here is that take a look at what you're doing, take a look at your thesis, and see how you can apply it to something bigger, something even more meaningful, so that you'll be able to answer the question, so what?